Well, good morning, everyone. My name's John Akers. I'm the Policy Director for the Land Promoters and Developers Federation. And I'm here to welcome Colin Morrison, who's the Senior Director for Sustainability in Turley. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar this morning. It's called A Route to Net Zero for Strategic Land. And this is a really topical issue. Very strong pressure, both economically and environmentally, to achieve net zero for land. And also there is a very strong political dimension to this, with the COP26 conference starting later on this year in November in Glasgow. And I gather that Turley will be sponsoring the COP26 virtual pavilion. So no doubt Colin will tell us more about that in a minute. This morning we heard that the Vauxhall company were planning to open a new battery plant at Ellesmere Port. And of course at the weekend we heard that another company, Nissan, were opening another battery plant in Sunderland. And of course, nearby to where I live in Coventry, there is a third battery plant. So it's all happening in the motor industry, and they have very ambitious targets. We're going to be talking about planning and strategic land today. We're all aware of the ambitions, the targets, the programs for net zero carbon by 2050. The important issue for me is how can we achieve it? What do we have to do as businesses, and what can we do as citizens to help achieve that target? So I'm hoping that Colin Morrison can give us some valuable help on that. Just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, so there'll be copies available for you afterwards. And if you do have questions for Colin, and I hope you do, then please direct them through the chat function, and we will come back after Colin has spoken, probably in about 20 minutes to half an hour, and deal with those questions, and I can field them directly to Colin. So welcome to everyone, and Colin, it's now over to you.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is well, and thank you for dialing in to listen to some of my our thoughts, Turley's thoughts, my team's thoughts on this, as John says, highly topical subject. I've been doing sustainability for many years, knocking on 25 now, actually, that happens this year. And I think there is, without doubt, over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a fundamental shift in the market on this issue. The amount of interest, opportunities, work that's been undertaken across the entire built environment now, driven from so many areas, funding, political, stakeholder, corporate, planning. It's been really encouraging to see that shift, but equally I think quite daunting, because there is still a huge amount we need to learn, and we need to understand about this issue. So hopefully in the very short time I have with you today, we can share some of our thoughts on this particular issue. And if you'll forgive me as well, I'm going to switch my camera off just while I'm giving the presentation, and then I'll switch it back on for questions and answers after, just to make sure it's a smooth process. So without further ado then, we shall proceed. Okay, just very briefly, a little bit about Turley. For those of you that aren't aware, we are a national consultancy, perhaps more known for our planning services, but I'd like to think that's changed, or very rapidly changing, because we have a host of other market-leading services, teams that operate within the Turley business. They're all listed there, and of course sustainability. I head up sustainability. I am a senior director. I've been at Turley for 11 years now, and I joined to build up the sustainability team, and to say we have been as busy as ever is certainly an understatement. So Turley's offices, locations, we are very well spread geographically across the UK. Our most recent office opening is in Dublin, which is going great guns at the moment. And I'm based, well, pre-COVID, I was based predominantly in the Birmingham office, although I have projects and clients across the UK. But at this moment in time, like I guess so many of us, currently in my little office in my house. Okay. Practicing what we preach, I think worthwhile just confirming in case there are any questions. Turley are a carbon neutral certified company. We have voluntarily reported our carbon footprint since 2016, and in fact our GHG footprint reports are available on our website. In June of last year, we became a certified carbon neutral company through a range of different measures. We developed our carbon neutral strategy in line with the UK's climate change targets and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We procure renewable energy. We've got a host of initiatives across our business to reduce energy use, not just those implemented, but a raft of measures proposed over the next few years. And then once we've reduced all our measures, procured renewable energy, we do use certified high quality offsets to mitigate all of our scope 1, 2 and 3 carbon emissions. So that includes our business travel, which is quite a significant commitment. And we offset via 2 projects, one a clean water project in East Africa, and 2 by supporting UK forestry in Cumbria. If anybody would like to know a bit more about our offsetting program, then do please get in touch. That's my sustainability team. Actually a little bit out of date because I have another 4 individuals joining over the next 2 months in response to high demand. Right, okay. I think we will start with some of the detail then. So let's start with some of the context. So a national climate emergency. So in February of 2019, the UK Climate Change Committee, who are becoming increasingly influential in government policy, for those of you that aren't aware, the Climate Change Committee is a body of highly distinguished experts who advise the government on the climate change strategy and implementing our legally binding targets. In February of 2019, they published this, Net Zero, the UK's contribution to stopping global warming. And in effect, that recommended that the UK government adopted a net zero carbon target, whereas the previous target was an 80% GHG emission reduction from 1990 baseline levels. So that was the new recommendation from the Climate Change Committee. In April of 2019, the UK Green Building Council released the Net Zero Carbon Framework on how to define and build net zero carbon buildings. And that's relevant as we talk later on. In May 2019, Parliament declared a climate emergency, and in June 2019, the UK adopted the net zero target by 2050. If anybody hasn't read this report, I think, particularly for those involved in the built environment, it is very worthwhile reading this because a lot of the recommendations within this report are slowly finding their way into policy. That was at a national level. Then we have a local climate emergency, and I'm quite certain that of all the people we have on this presentation today, those involved in land promotion and development, I'm sure they've probably got a project somewhere where there's been a local climate emergency declared, and this has been quite a phenomenon that has affected the planning process in the built environment. But it started in December 2018 when the GLA declared a climate emergency. By March of 2019, it was 68 local authorities. And by the 6th of July, 2021, it was 75% of local authorities have declared climate emergencies. Now, we've done some research on those. Last year, we did a big piece of research looking at all of the local authorities that had declared climate emergencies, what were their ambitions, and what was it likely to mean. And there's a set of very common criteria. Most are adopting net zero targets in advance of 2050, some as early as 2030, which is an enormous commitment to make. And also there are a wide range of commitments to measures, including revisions to current and future local plans to address climate change and net zero. What was also almost a universal commitment was to the production of a strategy for their administrative area or a group of administrative areas to address the net zero challenge. And that's very important. As we go through this, I thought it best to try and focus on practical examples because I think that's is always most powerful. And also because in my experience, the practical examples I'm going to run through are absolutely being repeated across the UK. So let's look at South Oxfordshire District Council, an area where I am doing quite a lot of work. So this is not untypical at all for a local authority that has declared a climate emergency. So, yep, they declared a climate emergency on the 11th of April 2019. They immediately established a climate emergency advisory committee. They met for the first time on the 19th of September. I actually attended that meeting along with a few subsequent meetings to that. They produced a report which committed to the district becoming carbon neutral within its own operations by 2025, and then committed to becoming a carbon neutral district by 2030. So they're fairly ambitious plans. I'm sure those of you are aware, because it was quite a high profile situation in terms of local plans. At the time, the local authority tried to withdraw the local plan. One of the reasons being when the new administration took over, I beg your pardon, they tried to withdraw the local plan that was currently in for submission because it failed to address the climate emergency. There was a bit of a discussion with the Secretary of State, and eventually it was adopted, but with significant targets with respect to climate change. Now, at this time, South Oxford District Council also pushed for a regional approach to addressing net zero. And this is where I think it starts to get quite interesting because, and relevant, very relevant to strategic land. I mentioned at the start that a lot of local authorities are, since declaring climate emergencies, are now starting to develop plans in terms of what their actions might be across a broad range of fronts, including planning, in order to address net zero. This report was published actually on the 29th of June. And it is a strategy, as you can see, it's called Pathway to a Zero Carbon Oxfordshire. And it's a report that's been prepared with the following stakeholders: Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, Oxfordshire County Council, the Low Carbon Hub, Cherwell District Council, Oxford City Council, West Oxfordshire District Council, South Oxfordshire and Vale of Whitehorse District Councils, Oxford Sciences Innovation, the Greater South East Energy Hub, Oxford Brook University, and Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. So quite a wide range of stakeholders, including a number of local authorities in that key kind of Oxford-Cambridge arc. When it was launched, there was also a high profile attendance from a number of individuals, including Andrew Griffith MP, who works closely with Alok Sharma, beg your pardon, who obviously is the Minister for COP26. It's definitely got some political links. Now, what is it about this document and why is it relevant to strategic land? Well, okay, this is all those Oxford authorities that I've just listed have combined to drive forward net zero. The document is intended to shape all economic and development activity within South Oxfordshire until 2050. That's a long timescale. Now, we also know that within the Oxcam arc, we've got this fantastic target of 1 million homes to be built by 2050. And we've got a 25% projected increase in population by 2031. So this report sets the context by saying there's huge development planned in this region. How can we meet those objectives while still striving to be net zero? And the report makes a number of statements up front, which is effectively that in order to achieve net zero, the new housing and economic growth must be decoupled from rising carbon emissions if we are to hit net zero. So I thought it would be very useful to go through this report in a little bit of detail. I would recommend you read it for those that have a development plan in this area. I thought it would be useful to go through this report to see what are the recommendations and how might this shape the spatial pattern of land and type of new housing. Because as I said, this type of report is going to be coming out really from just about all local authorities that have declared a climate emergency. So it is a multiple page document. I think it's about 100 odd pages. So I'm going to go through this in relatively swift detail, but effectively they developed an action plan for Oxfordshire based on 4 key themes: transport, energy efficiency and heating demand, zero carbon energy, and land use and sequestration. I'm going to go through each of those themes in a little bit more detail, again, trying to draw out what might be implications for strategic land. What do we think might happen coming forward? So let's look at transport. So the report had a number of key points to note. 1, transport emissions have continued to rise across Oxfordshire. I suppose no surprise. Picked out a few interesting statistics. Planning permissions within 10 kilometres of employment dropped from 64% to 38% over the last decade. Less than 10% of permissions were close to a train station. Even though it was noted that we are going to switch to electric vehicles. Obviously, we have this legally binding deadline of 2030 for a sale of petrol and diesel emissions. It was noted that even though we are going to switch to EVs, that will help, but that will not address the spatial distribution nor provide more footfall to local shops and high streets. So the report concluded that spatial plans must focus on housing close to employment, services, facilities, urban areas, and sustainable modes of transportation. Now, this isn't new. I know that many of those in this meeting, and indeed my team and I, have supported a number of clients. Getting a new housing site in a sustainable location is, of course, a key requirement and objective of everybody on this call. But what is stark, I think, in this report is that it absolutely starts to draw some red lines about where it starts to define about where that location might be in order to promote net zero. It also states that any new housing must offer an alternative to a private car with electric vehicles included, but only as a last resort. And indeed, it states that all new housing must aim for carbon neutrality in transport emissions. That's an interesting recommendation, and perhaps more to discuss later on that one. Let's look at energy efficiency and heating demand. So what does it say about new homes? And indeed, I'm very conscious that it's not just new homes, it's also employment. We need a huge amount of employment space. But I think these principles apply not just to homes, but also to non-domestic buildings as well. Some key points to note. The report says that every home built that is not net zero carbon now makes the problem bigger and more costly for all. It states that the future home standard is a step forward, but it's not enough. National policy needs to be far more ambitious. We must transition from gas to electric heating very, very quickly for all buildings. Retrofitting of the existing housing stock is the biggest challenge to net zero. And indeed, in terms of what might be acceptable for on-site standards, passive house is seen as the solution. So because of these key points, what can we expect to see in the plans for those local authorities within those regions? Well, we can see continued progression of local policies to raise on-site standards. I think it's quite likely we will continue to see introductions of carbon offset funds to raise money to pay for decarbonisation. And I also think that we can expect to see the requirements for a comprehensive strategy for net zero for large strategic sites. I just thought at this point it might be worthwhile just reflecting, because in that previous slide we've dealt with energy efficiency standards. It might be just worth reflecting on where we sit with regards to future changes to the building regulations. And this, obviously, we could have an entire separate presentation on this subject alone, but I think it's worthwhile just reminding, because I've mentioned it. I mentioned the Future Home Standard in the previous slide. Well, indeed, that is the Future Home Standard was the standard confirmed by the government in January of this year. The Future Home Standard is being implemented in full in 2025, whereby all homes built in 2025 must have a circa 75%, emit circa 75% less carbon emissions than those built to the current regulations. The government views these houses built to this standard as being suitable for net zero, i.e. net zero ready. As an interim step to this 2025 standard, there are changes to Part L coming in next year, 2022. Well, actually, it's the end of this year, but there's an implementation date of summer next year, whereby homes must be 31% more energy efficient. So next year, all new homes are 31% energy efficient, and then by 2025, they'll be 75% more energy efficient. And the government has already indicated that they will start to think of future standards beyond 2025. And very briefly, what does that mean for new dwellings? Well, for new dwellings built from next year, 31% improvement. There's improved U values. You may still get away with a gas boiler, but effectively these regs are all pushing you to use heat pumps and not use gas. Probably you'll have some PV on a roof if you don't use an air source heat pump, not necessarily needing wastewater heat recovery. And the government thinks that this will cost between 3 and 5 grand per dwelling. Then in 2025, home change significantly. Almost every single dwelling, without exception, will have a big chunk of PV on it. It won't use gas. It will use air source heat pumps or ground source to produce the heat. It will have much lower U values, and it will be designed differently in order to meet those particular standards. So very briefly, that's just in terms of context. Now, again, for context, that report from the Low Carbon Oxfordshire indicates or states that this standard is not enough to hit net zero. And indeed, the Climate Change Committee indicates as such as well. So we can probably expect to see some standards after that. But I appreciate, of course, that is a big leap between now and 2025. Okay, let's look at something else. So I mentioned some of the other issues around recommendations coming out from this report and how it may affect land use. The report stated that for the area, renewable energy generation, Oxfordshire, for renewable energy generation, Oxfordshire, especially PV, needs to be expanded dramatically. There is a need to link large-scale PV with development to meet higher electrical demand from development. As I mentioned, we are moving towards an all-electric energy strategy. There are big pressures on the grid, and indeed, I'm sure there's many on this call who have probably looked at their sites or going through some assessment or technical work and identified that their grid connection costs are significantly higher now because of the move to an electric-only strategy. The report notes that battery technology has a key role to play, and noting John's comments at the start around the motor manufacturer and a slew of announcements around the production of gigafactories. Certainly battery technology has a role to play in new housing development. It also noted that electrical transmission infrastructure needs huge upgrades, and who's going to pay for that? What might this happen? What might this mean for South Oxfordshire? Oh, sorry, for Oxfordshire as a whole. A much greater appetite for large-scale solar PV, especially linked to development. And noting we might well have some developers on here who are interested in renewable energy development. Innovative technologies are likely to be strongly supported, and there may well be prioritization of sites with good electrical infrastructure. Okay, There's a bigger section on land use and sequestration in this report. So I thought, again, it's worthwhile having a look at what the recommendations are here. So the report concluded that net zero can only be achieved with smart land use policies. So we can see net zero being integral to emerging local plans and the selection of land. New land and spatial planning should prioritise carbon sequestration, natural capital, biodiversity protection, climate mitigation and adaptation. There should be big increases of local food and energy production. There's a need to double woodland areas to about 18% of regions' available land, currently from 9%. Proposed new housing and development will create bigger problems around net zero if high quality agricultural land is used. And I think as well, it's worthwhile reflecting that the report does recognise there are many examples of well-planned development that address this problem and lead by example. So I think that's, of course, we all know that, and I'll come on to this later, that there is enormous contribution that we can make to net zero. We need development, and of course we need it in the right location, and that's indeed what everybody on this CPD is very keen to ensure. Also, an interesting fact is that really starting to recognise that, again, something that perhaps we were all aware of, that certainly post-COVID, the report recognises that green infrastructure has a much higher value to society than perhaps we had previously assumed. And indeed, it tries to quantify this and says that new green infrastructure has exponentially greater social and economic benefits than actually the original cost. And I think, if memory serves, the report states that green infrastructure of circa 50 million cost might result in billions of benefits to health and well-being and social sustainable development. So recognising the benefits of green infrastructure. So what might we see then in terms of land use and sequestration? What did the report recommend? Well, it stated that climate change and the drive to net zero should be a strong factor with respect to land allocations. We, as a development industry, need to sell all benefits of sites with respect to net zero pathways. Each site, be it small or large, can make a significant contribution to net zero. There's likely to be greater protection for high-grade agricultural land. And key issues coming forward in terms of land use and development are green infrastructure, tree planting, renewable energy, biodiversity enhancement and protection, climate resilience, perhaps are now much more important issues going forward. Clearly they're already there, and I know many developers take this very seriously and address these issues very positively, but if possible, these are likely to be even more pronounced in future land use policies. Okay, I'll just conclude then. The report's made a number of conclusions and recommendations overall, and I've picked out some of them that are more relevant to strategic land. One, there should be a strict approach to planning, regulation and compliance for new homes and developments so that they do not result in increased carbon emissions from the building, transport or energy sectors. There should be a reduction in overall travel demand through smart planning and investment. There should be restoration of ecosystems and natural capital for enhanced sequestration and an increased biodiversity. And there should be much greater deployment of solar PV. So some of the key recommendations coming out from that report for all of those local authorities in that region. Now, what does that mean? Well, as I mentioned before, that's a very timely report because it does start to give us some indications about planning, land use, strategic land, and the issues that we will need to address as part of this region's commitment to net zero. All local authorities are developing their net zero pathways, with some already published, and there are some quite common similarities. Many recommendations in that Oxfordshire report are supported by the Climate Change Committee. They're present in this report. So it's likely to be a very consistent set of principles applied across those local authorities that push for net zero. But of course, those principles may be implemented to different degrees depending on, of of course, political and member and policy considerations. And of course, however, one thing we cannot overlook is that we still need millions of homes and employment land to meet social and economic and environmental challenges. There is a massive demand for housing and employment, and we must meet that if we're to, that plays just an important role in the route to net zero, as does the correct allocation of land. Local authorities, there's a huge requirement for them to upskill to meet this challenge. And I think through this development pathway, through this route to net zero, I think certainly everybody on this call, we are committed to achieving good growth. And I think the best way to do that is through partnerships with local authorities, and indeed highlighting that development has a huge contribution to make on the route to net zero. So I may start concluding now, if I may, in terms of trying to draw that together and what that might mean for strategic land. Well, I think going forward, net zero contribution, or the impact that strategic land will have, will play a much greater role in allocations. How we will see that? Well, I think we're going to have to see how that plays on the ground, but there's probably some conclusions we can make. Plans are even more likely to co-locate housing with transport infrastructure and employment growth. We're going to really see a continued push, if not greater push, on developments that minimize car trips and maximize self-containment are likely to be favored. There'll be an even greater premium on sustainable infrastructure for a site and how it can make a site sustainable. And when I refer to sustainable infrastructure, I'm talking about transport, I'm talking about energy, and I'm talking about nature. We can expect, in fact, we are already seeing a much greater scrutiny of this issue during the planning process. I think we're going to need to see greater work at promotion, application and construction stage to highlight the net zero benefits of a site. And I think we can without doubt see greater expectations stroke planning conditions applied to strategic land. So what might we recommend? What kind of things have we been doing? Well, I think this plan that was released, the Pathway to Zero Carbon in Oxfordshire, is launched. There's an opportunity to engage with the process, and I think that is something that the strategic land, whether it's the LPDF or developers in particular, should really be aware of these plans and start to engage with them, because there is a huge amount that development can do to help the route to net zero, and there's big contributions that can be made. So engage with the process, engage with the plans, look at representations and highlight the benefits of your sites. We should be considering, and I know some clients do this already, consider climate and net zero strengths when identifying sites. Sustainable transport links, train in particular. Well, of course, not every site has a train station, of course, we know that. But I think all signs point to those being of particular importance. And perhaps it's not just train sites in present, it's obviously with one eye very firmly on future transport infrastructure. Interestingly, a site that has good energy infrastructure, good connections nearby, minimize costs to get to upgrade your energy infrastructure, might well be at a premium now, given that we're moving to all electric. The ability of a site to provide strong green infrastructure, sites that are close to employment, services, facilities to minimize car trips. Are we going to need to demonstrate carbon neutrality in transport? Quite a big ask, but one that perhaps we can rise to. And of course, no flooding risk. I think going forward, we're going to have to look at, I would certainly recommend looking at councils, how they change their site assessment and allocation criteria to take account of net zero, particularly the SA, or whatever form SEA regulations take going forward. I think be prepared to highlight the climate change benefits of your site. This is an infographic we did for a client. We do lots of infographics for clients demonstrating the climate change benefits of the site. We're doing more and more of these at a site promotion stage now, with some positive responses from local authorities actually. Also for sites, consider measures to highlight how your land can promote net zero strategies locally. Take a look at what the local plans are and see if there's any way to contribute. Provision of smart grids on site and all electric strategy, use of innovative technologies, indeed strong green infrastructure. Many of those things, I know there are clients already doing these, but I think perhaps there's a little bit of work needed up front to really highlight that at the allocation stage and link that all back to the net zero pathway. And I think that takes me to 11:05, 30 minutes hopefully on the dot. And I hope everyone found that useful, a very brief tour of my thoughts. I will stop sharing my screen and put my cam back on. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Colin. That was a really interesting movement through the guidance, the legislation, and obviously the tips for the future. And I think one thing I took from that is that there is no silver bullet. It's a range of different options and solutions for trying to tackle climate change. And obviously, people like Colin and Colin himself will be very useful in guiding you when you have sites which come forward to try and present them in their best light. Now, I've got one or two questions, but and would like more, but I've got quite a few questions of my own, Colin, if I may. And I suppose the biggest question for
By the
me
way,
is,
John, not too technical though, please.
Oh, no, nothing technical at all. No. Philosophical question to start with. One of the things that always strikes me about climate change really is, what can I do myself? How can I change things? And I'm sure that the companies out there will be thinking the same. What can they do to help? And I suppose the question really is climate change mitigation all about how we live our lives? Or is it about how we build our homes? Or is it how we choose our sites? It seems to me there are three different angles to it, aren't there? Which do you think is most important of those?
Good questions, John. Okay, I'll take the first one, if I may, which was around what is it we can do? Well, I think there's lots and lots and lots of things that each individual can do. But first of all, look how you travel. Try to travel less. I mean, I think, you know, one thing, teams, I mean, great. I mean, look, today we were just joking, we've got, I think we had 100 people accepted for this webinar. Fantastic. And if we talked about doing it in person, where in a physical location, we might have got maybe 20 or 30, but we've managed to reach hopefully over 100 via an online seminar. I think how much carbon emissions that has saved just by doing this. So it's all, as an individuals in our workplace, try to use Teams more and less travel. Purchase an electric vehicle, get a bike, cut down on transport. Look at the green tariff, procure green electricity for your individual home. I've got one relatively straightforward, and the cost difference is not very much at all. All kinds of things about how we choose to eat, cut down on red meat. There's loads of different options I think we can all do. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of even the smallest measures, because I think the phrase is what if. I always like to use what if. Okay, if I did something, might only save 0.5 ton of carbon, but what if everybody did it? It's a big change. And also it might help to drive market demand even further. So I think there's a few thoughts. In terms of the mitigation points and the 3 points, climate mitigation, the phrase, I think, is just all about saving. So those 3 measures you talked about, to be honest, they're all interlinked and they're all important.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you for that. One of the things you talked about was the need for more green infrastructure and how important that was going to be. And it's something that strikes me about the way that government policy is moving. So, for example, we had a change in the standard methodology for housing just before Christmas, which aimed to focus a lot more housing into urban areas and concentrate numbers into the 20 largest cities. Now, at the same time, we have a COVID pandemic where people are all thinking at home, we really do need to move house, and we need to buy somewhere with a garden and with more space so that we can work at home. Now, do you see a contradiction there? Because on the one hand, we have government emphasizing the need for more density, And yet, on the other hand, we have the good British public saying, no, actually, we'd like easier, greener, less dense houses where we have more space.
Well, good contradictions. I suspect that's not the only one we've had over the last 18 months, but let's not let's go there and have the list. The standard method, and I'll certainly there'll be people like you and others on this call, or indeed my colleagues in economics who know far more about this than I do. But I think obviously, yes, very aware of the proposed changes and the implications. Now, from a climate perspective and from a net zero perspective, the shift to put more housing towards cities actually should, in theory, reduce carbon emissions. Now, has that been part of the plan? I don't know whether that was one of the intended or unintended impacts. But I would absolutely agree that human nature being as it is, and I'm part of that and exactly the same, which is actually that is not necessarily what people want, and what people do want is a home that, yes, has more access to green space, perhaps is a bit more in the rural area, countryside. And I think I doubt that will ever go away. I think that's probably there, particularly even more so post-COVID. But again, perhaps that just shows, I mentioned at the start that there's been a huge shift in this issue over the last 2 years. And suddenly it feels like we're finally starting to get to grips with what it is we need. And we don't have all the solutions. And you're right, I don't think there is a silver bullet. There's a lot of things that need to be done. And perhaps now a reflection further on recognizing where people want to live needs to be built into the standard method, because if more people want to live in rural areas, but they're working from home more, if this phenomenon is now bedded in, then actually perhaps it is not straightforward to say that it is immediately a more sustainable option to have homes in built up areas. Someone's working at home close to shops, services, facilities may well have a lower environmental impact than those in a service. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not aware of a study that's looked at that, but that's an interesting discussion to have.
I think you encapsulated it, didn't you, in the answer to the first question when you talked about the merits of people working from home, and how we got more people to attend a seminar which was virtual than we would have done if it were actual. And it sort of highlights the issue of unintended consequences in a way, doesn't it? I've got a question from Bex Russell, who said, what is the longevity of these batteries? This is in relation to my comments in the introduction about car batteries. What is the longevity of these batteries, and how do we dispose of them? And that, of course, is the challenge, isn't it? Because we invent a new technology, and that technology has its own shortcomings in terms of possibly pollution, possibly extra weight of cars, possibly logistical problems of finding points to fill up, how big the range for a car is, and so on. So I don't know, how do you overcome these sort of unintended consequences in the world of climate change mitigation?
Well, I seem to recall as well, if I may, that when solar PV really started to take off let's just say for argument's sake, 10 years ago, there was a big debate in the industry about, okay, solar PV takes more energy to create and then it saves, and therefore is it the right way forward? I think that argument's gone now, and we're just in a situation where it is the norm, and actually because of manufacturing, and it's kind of accepted that the benefits of solar PV outweigh the negatives. I think with regards to batteries, we're going to be in exactly the same situation, which is, to be fair, there's very genuine points. Lithium is a vital material for battery production, and but it carries an environmental impact, and with it to extract. but that can be managed and that can be mitigated, and the overall benefits in terms of impact on climate change are better than potential environmental impacts from mining, but which can be mitigated. So I think that it's a conversation that I think we've all got to have, but I think batteries play a vital part. And of course, the evolution of battery tech, we know they're already getting more efficient. They're getting, some of the charging is now up to 300 miles for some of the vehicles. And in terms of what we do to dispose of them, the longevity, if memory serves, and again, I haven't checked this for a while, but I think there's at least a guarantee of 5 to 10 years, I think, on some of the new vehicles. What I do know, because I have had conversations, we've been involved with a number of, at an early stage with gigafactories, when you produce a car battery, and when it is no longer suitable for a car, that's because it loses a certain percentage of its charge. These batteries could then be used for other forms because they're still fully functional, they're just not as efficient. So potentially I knew of one manufacturer that was looking to take in those batteries from cars once they'd reached their meaningful end of use and convert them into batteries to use for houses. Mm. And I'm sure there'll be, because they're valuable products, I'm sure there'll be a way to recycle them.
Yeah. Colin, when we started, or before we started, you mentioned that Turley were involved in the UK Green Building Council in developing net zero building.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Because one of the main features of your presentation was the changes to Part L and the improvements in carbon efficiency.
Yeah, sure, of course, thank you. So effectively, I mean, in April 2019, when the Climate Change Committee had stated that, okay, we now need to up our game and we now need to go for net zero as a target, the UK Green Building Council, who are a fantastic organisation driving forward all things net zero in the built environment, got a team of industry experts together, which included ourselves, thankfully, along with many others, esteemed organisations, to pull together guidance to say, okay, we appreciate where the government is going with regards to the building regulations. We don't think it's enough. We need to go further. So they produced a document on how to build a framework on how to build net zero carbon buildings, both domestic and non-domestic. It's been transformational, in my opinion, probably more of a take-up in the non-domestic sector than in domestic. But I think if we take logistics in particular, which is now leading the way, to put it into context, my team and I at the moment, we have, I think by latest count, 30 million square feet of logistics we are designing to be net zero in accordance with this plan. Larger scale institutional investors changing their funding streams to say we will only purchase net zero sites, a real fundamental shift, and lots of developers, PLP and others committing publicly to net zero. So it's been quite transformational, and that's a piece of work that will continue. And you know, whilst it is achievable, and there are different routes for different types of buildings, it is something that I think we may find in 2030 might well be the norm.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. And clearly an awful lot being done in terms of new building. What about building back better? It's a slogan which the government use quite a bit. And of course, it isn't so much the new stock that we need to worry about, although that's really important. It's also the existing stock and the need to try and improve the energy efficiency of that.
Absolutely.
So how do you think we're going to tackle the whole issue of retrofitting?
Well, they need to, but they haven't. I mean, if you recall, when the government launched their, I think it was last year, their emergency COVID measures in their budget, they actually introduced a voucher scheme, I think, of £5,000 contribution towards a building to improve its energy efficiency. And then I think, if memory serves, they then quietly ditched that in the last budget. It is a massive issue. They have not addressed it. There was the Green Deal a while ago. And the truth is, I think they absolutely need to. Now, at a local authority level, I know that they recognise it. So if you take the likes of, well, the major cities, Bristol, of course, London, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, etc., a lot of them recognise the need to encourage retrofit. And there is, well, in GLA, you have the GLA Carbon Offset Fund, which is used huge sums of money collected, and retrofitting of buildings is something that is part of that. So you may find that local authorities start to take things into their own control and start to plan retrofitting, but even then it's a challenge. So I think there is a huge challenge there for government. They need to come up with a plan to do that, and of course it shouldn't necessarily, it's not going to be the responsibility of new development to pay for that. That's really not appropriate.
Yeah, okay, that's useful. Now look, I've got a few questions from the delegates. So Edward Tyler has asked a question. This is in relation to my point about green infrastructure.
Yeah.
Does Colin think that the gross to net site areas will be squeezed with the emerging needs for more green infrastructure, etc.?
I think there's going to be more and more need for tree planting. I think every single report suggests the need for tree. Now, of course, there is only so much physically one can get on a site, of course. But I think there will be constant pressure, whether or not there's an actual change to any form of ratio, I don't know. But of course, the other thing to probably add in here is that one could argue that there's greater pressure on green infrastructure coming from things like the requirement for biodiversity net gain than there is perhaps from the climate mitigation. But of course, the two go hand in hand. So I think that it's inevitable that there just will be greater pressure for more green infrastructure. But I suggest, given that there is only, there's a limit to it, and there is, of course, a viability issue and a certain percentage of housing that can be provided and etc. I suggest that's one of the things that we'll need to have a discussion with. And of course, as just about as well, it's the provision of smart and good and multifunctional green infrastructure. So it's not necessarily the quantity, it's more the quality, I would argue, as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I've got a second one here. It's from Charles Cordery. You mentioned the government said that Part L building regs add an additional £3,000 to £5,000 per plot to build cost per dwelling. He says, what is the additional capital build cost to achieve net zero per dwelling? Do you have that?
Yeah, okay. So the £3,000 to £5,000 costs is the government's figures in their impact assessment, but that is for the interim standard next year. So that is for the 31% improvement, not the 75%. There is no government figure at this moment in time. There was no impact assessment to accompany the future home standard for 2025, which said, gave an estimate of costs. Personally, we've just been working on a rough rule of thumb of £10,000 plot to meet this 2025 standard. But again, that will differ based on sites. It will differ based on the approach that a particular developer will build. And the government has said that they're certainly hoping that things like costs for heat pumps will drop considerably, because effectively heat pumps will just be as common as gas boilers are right now. So there's estimated to be a significant cost, but at the moment there is no formal estimate of what it takes to be 2025. To meet a net zero dwelling, again, it depends on the definition, but if we were building to net zero for UK Green Building Council, and if we were implementing that in accordance with, shall we say, with that definition as well as also referenced in that Oxfordshire report, and I think it is gathering pace as something that is perhaps akin to a more true net zero development, then costs for that would be reduction of embodied carbon, offsetting, and I think we're working on the process that can be anything from, depending on the size of the house, maybe £40 to £1,000 a dwelling, £40 to £1,000 a dwelling, And then there's construction costs as well on top of that, which I think coming out the region of 10, maybe 10 to 15,000. But again, it's highly dependent on the type of dwelling. And of course, that's something that you can seek advice on and work through a process. But there's definitely, it's been quite pleasantly surprising how many clients we are supporting now with regards to that net zero. And indeed, there's some developers, if memory serves, Fakenham Homes being one, that's publicly committed to that net zero development to 2025 indeed. So there's lots of movement in the market.
Okay, that's interesting. So now, a lot of what you've been saying relates to the builders themselves, and yes, that has an impact on land value, and therefore indirectly an impact on land promoters. But in terms of land promotion, people who are looking for sites, sourcing sites and delivering sites, what sort of measures do you think they could employ, if you like, to get an edge on competitors or to stand more chance of getting a planning consent? Is it things like solar, separate solar PV areas on site, or I mean, location? Clearly, they don't have much choice. Once they've got a site, it is where it is. I guess they can provide public transport facilities, bus stops maybe, or rerouting a service. But, you know, they have limited scope as to what they can do to actually improve the sustainability of their site. Have you got any additional ideas as to what they might do to try and improve their climate change mitigation?
Yeah, no, and I think it did cover some of that on some of the last slides, but it's I think, yes, of course, and acknowledging that, you know, we need so much housing and so much development that clearly only a very relatively small percentage might be close to a train station. Inevitably, we will need sites, particularly rural sites, because we need housing in rural areas to maintain the vitality and functionality of some smaller conurbations. Yes, so the ability to locate to influence a site and its location, and then what can you do after that, it then comes down to what more site measures you can do. Now, undoubtedly, we are seeing as well the inclusion of more renewables on sites. So yes, we're working with clients on some projects where even for sites as low as 300, 400, 500 homes or even less, there's an area for some form of PV on site. PV continues to drop in cost, and indeed that's something that can be done. You can make commitments to the types of the types of dwellings you're going to build to. You can improve those commitments on site. Yes, of course, transport is key. Can we even promote some form of self-containment, making sure everyone has the ability to work from home, provision of high quality broadband, inclusion of facilities to support connection to local buses, cycles, links to walking connectivity, etc., etc., etc. I think there's lots of things that you can look at on a site-by-site basis to promote an individual site. I would also add as well, I would also suggest is important is wherever you are promoting a site, it's worth looking at the local strategies around this issue, because it might be there are certain things that is relevant to a local authority that we can promote. Okay,
I think we've almost run out of time now, Colin. So I'm going to just ask you one more question, and that is, if you were in charge, if you were the Minister for the Environment, DEFRA, or indeed the Minister for Planning and Communities, what's the one thing that you would do to try and improve the situation? What would you do if you had the choice?
I would come up with a robust national strategy that would meet the objectives and would provide a consistency of approach, so that everybody had a plan and knew exactly where we were going to go. I think it's fantastic that a lot of the local authorities have taken this route of climate emergencies, and it's brilliant, and the work, and it's I think it's fantastic, but I get more and more concerned when this is such a deeply technical issue. I think local authorities are already overstretched, and I do worry that without some proper, it's hard enough for me to recruit new people, although I've got 3 more joining next month. But you know, for us to get this right, I think we need stronger guidance from government, and I would also say some money as well to back that up. So that's what I would do. But I haven't had the call yet, so who knows?
Okay, well that's really helpful, Colin. Thanks very much. Basically, more clarity, more money, and more consistency then, so that people actually know what they're doing. Essentially,
And an ambitious strategy, yeah, proper strategy. Proper strategy.
What I would say is you need a level playing field so that the builders can build on it. So thank you very much, Colin. Really grateful to you, and thank you very much for those of you who joined us. We've had an interesting set of questions from the delegates. Thank you for that, and I hope you will join us again when we have another webinar in the future. So Colin, thank you again, and thank you to Lucy, our events coordinator, who's provided all the technical backing in the background. So have a good day and goodbye.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks to everyone, and stay safe. Take care of yourselves. Thank you.
Bye-bye.